Hello and welcome back to another episode of Math with Son. Today we're going to be doing some similar right triangles. And this is a complicated one for a lot of people. So what I like to do is draw three triangles that are embedded in this one triangle. The first one is the obvious one, and that is the big one. Okay? So this big one is the overall shape, and I'm going to redraw it. And I'm going to try and make it to where it's noticeable that this part right here is a little bit shorter. Okay, so when I'm drawing it, I try and make it draw a little bit more exaggerated. And on this big triangle, all we know is that this part is 100. And then I draw a medium triangle the same way. The medium triangle is going to be the one that I'm going to highlight right now. It is this one right here. And you may notice that the bottom or the short side of this medium triangle is x. So if you kind of flip it and rotate it, you can see the hypotenuse here is blank, but then that side right there is x, the shortest of the three sides, excuse me. And then last but not least, we have the small triangle. And the small triangle in this case, we know right here that this short side is 36. Okay? Now there's one other thing that is in these three triangles that we actually have, and that is if we do 100 minus 36, we get this part right here, which could be very helpful. So we're going to do that real quick. 100 minus 36 is 64. So that part right here is 64. So that is the bottom of the medium triangle right here. And not only that, but look on the small triangle, which I'm going to highlight as well. We had 36 here as the short side, but we have x on the other side. Okay? Now we have to look at all three triangles and ask ourselves, what do we have two of on each one? And that would be the medium and the small in this case. And they pair up. So I'm going to do that now. We're going to have the x and the 36 pair up. I'm going to do x over 36, so I'm doing medium triangle over small triangle, must be equal to medium triangle 64 over x. And what's going to happen here is something very common where you multiply x times x in your cross multiplication and you get x squared is equal to 36 and 64 multiplied together. That is very common to get the x squared. That's perfectly fine. 64 times 36 is 2034. So we get x squared is equal to 2034. 304, excuse me. 304. And then you square root. And the square root of that is going to be our answer. Now, if you don't have a calculator, this could be really difficult to find out that the answer is 48. But another trick that you could do is square root the 64 and square root the 36. And you end up with the square root of 64 is 8, and the square root of 36 is 6, and 8 times 6 is 48. That's the way to do it without the calculator. All right? We got one more, number 2. Well, one more for the first half. I'm going to these generally are just hard to begin with. They don't get much harder. So here, this is the way that I like to see them, where I have the bottom. I like drawing the big triangle where the bottom is right here, where we have x, and we got 25. And it looks like we're going to use the bigger triangle here because we have two things. Anytime you have two things, it's typically the triangle you're going to use. The medium triangle is this one right here. And the only thing we have on the medium triangle is 16, which I got from 16 plus 9 make 25, or 25 minus 9 make 16. And we have nothing there, so this is going to be 16, and this is always the bottom, the way I draw it, of the medium. Always the bottom of the medium, and this is always the bottom of the small, if you are consistent. So we have 9 on the bottom of the small, and that would mean that x is going to be across from the 90 degrees of the small, across from the 90 degrees of the smallest triangle. Now we have to look, and we're like, all right, what triangles, two triangles, do we have two things each on? And that would be the big triangle and the small triangle. And as long as you're consistent, you're going to be okay. I'm going to put small x over 25 big will equal small 9 over big triangle x. Cross multiply, we get x times x is x squared. 9 times 25 You can square root right now. You could square root in your calculator with multiplying, but I'm going to do it without a calculator. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 25 is 5. 3 times 5 makes 15. Now, you could have multiplied 9 times 25, got 225, and then square rooted to get 15, but both ways work out. All right? So let's see if we can find a more unique one. I think 4 is a little more unique in the sense that x is in a different location again. So I'm going to redraw it. I'm going to draw this one kind of the way they have it. This is still the bottom of the big. Bottom of the big. So we're not putting anything there. X here, and then 81. And then our medium triangle, remember that this middle part is always the bottom of the medium. That is always the bottom of the medium triangle if you draw it the way that I'm drawing it right now. So if that's the bottom of the medium, that means that 45 can't be the bottom of the medium. Okay? And that means that x is always, well, not always, but x is, the hypotenuse is always across from the 90. So that's why I got x there. And I could draw the small triangle if I wanted to. And the small triangle, I have nothing here. I have nothing here. This is the bottom of the small, which would end up being 81 minus 45. But I don't need that. Why don't I need that is because I have two things on the big triangle and I have two things on the medium triangle, and they're in the same location. So I can immediately begin to cross multiply here. I'm going to do 81 over x for right now is equal to x over 45. So keep those sides consistent. Hypotenuse over hypotenuse. Leg over leg. Cross multiply, you get x squared is equal to 81 times 45. You can multiply 81 times 45, but remember my trick. You could square root both individually, but at this time, it won't really work out because 45 doesn't square root. So you get x squared is equal to 3645. And then if you square root that, you would get 60.37, which in geometry is normally how you would leave it. If you are not allowed to leave it that way, according to the instructions, it says simplest radical form. If you're not allowed to leave it that way, you can square root in the beginning before multiplying. The square root of 81 is still 9, and you get 9 square roots of 45, which is another answer, but not the simplified answer, I might add. The square root of 45 is 9 times 5. The square root of 9 times square root of 5. And the square root of 9 is 3. So if you do that, you'd have 3 on the outside with the 9 before the 5. And 9 times 3 is 27, radical 5, which is why most geometry teachers would probably stop at 60.37. But you might have somebody, a teacher, that is wanting it to be in simplest radical form, and there is the simplest radical form, easiest way to do it. All right, let's see. I'm going to look and see if there's any that are unique. I think 8 is unique, but I'm running out of room for it. I'm still going to do number 8. It's got an x here, and I don't think we've had an x there, so giving you a variety of problems. So let's look at the big triangle here. The big triangle, we have not 64, but 64 plus x, which might be useful. Might being the key word. Might not be. We got a medium triangle. If you draw it in the way that I do, the medium triangle, this part is always the bottom of the medium. 90, across from the 90 of the medium, we have nothing. So I'm not going to write anything there. And then the 64 is going to be the longer side. I like making the bottom middle part of the medium shortest. And then we got the small triangle. The small triangle, we have, if this is the bottom of the medium, then that means that the x has to be the bottom of the small. The x is, the bottom of the medium is the part in the middle every time, which means that the bottom of the small has got to be not the middle. 48 is going to be the longer side of the small. We're going to use not the biggest triangle, but the medium and the small here. So in this case, we won't have an x squared, which is unique. We're going to have, I'm going to do, let's say, the bottom x over 48, bottom x over 48 is equal to 48 over 64. So those two other sides. And I did the small triangle on the top. Cross multiply, 64 times x is equal to 48 times 48, or 48 squared. I don't know what 48 times 48 is. 48 times 48 is big. It's 2304 is equal to 64x. We divide, and when you divide 2,304 by 64, you get 36. Okay? I might do one more. I'm just going to do one on the back. Let's see. Which problem do I feel like your teacher would give you? I feel like your teacher might give you 14, and I feel like 14 might be a hard problem. It might not be. These other radical problems, you just keep it in your calculator, and we can go from there. So let's start with drawing the biggest triangle. The biggest triangle is a little confusing in the sense that you got 64 here, but x is the whole way across. So that's the big triangle. Let's draw the medium one. Remember the spot in the middle, the way I like to draw it is always the bottom of the medium. And then the small, where you make your short side here. The small triangle, we have missing this part, but we might be able to finagle something out of it. But the 48 would go here. And as it sits right now, I feel like I forgot something. What did I forget? Well, I forgot the 64 on the medium triangle, but we're still in a dilemma because I don't have two things on two different triangles. So like I can pair up x with no other hypotenuse, and I can pair up the 48 and the 64, but we have a dilemma here. So you have options, okay? Here are the two options. You have two sides, two numbered sides of the medium triangle, which means you could use a squared plus b squared equals c squared to find that missing side of the medium triangle. That's an option, which it might be the easier option. The other option that we can do is we can write this as 64 minus x. Nope, excuse me. We can write this side right here as x minus 64 because the whole way across is x. If we take away 64, we would have that part right there on the small triangle. So that would be one other option, as writing this as x minus 64. Okay? So if you do that, then we will be using the small and the medium triangle. If you do that, you'd use the small and the medium triangle. You'd have x minus 64 over 48 is equal to 48 over 64. And you could solve that and you would get one potential option. The other thing you could do is, and it might be easier, is find that missing side. Anytime you have two sides of a right triangle, you can always use the Pythagorean theorem to find the other. So I'm going to do that real quick. We got 64 squared plus 48 squared is equal to that, and then you square root that to get 80 as this missing side. Okay? Would that be helpful? Yes and no. Like it might be. We have the 80 and the x, but do we have any other sides of the larger triangle to help us out with? And the answer to that is no. So even though that 80 is there, you can't use it just to get x. So we are forced, even though it was helpful, sometimes you do math and it helps, but not completely. 64 times x minus 64 would equal 48 times 48, which I think we've already done, is 2304. 64, distribute x. 64 times 64 ends up equaling negative 4096 there. We have to add the 4096. We get 64x is equal to 2304 plus 4096, 6397. And then we divide by 64 and we get our answer. 6397 divided by 64 is 99.95, which is not a radical, so we'd have to keep it as 99.95 unless I made a tiny error, but I don't think I did. So that is going to do it for this one, ladies and gentlemen. Until next time, stay positive, and I will see y'all later. Bye.